Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and I am a survivor of Bob Jones University. And this is Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism, which is a podcast that sheds light on Christian fundamentalism in the context of Bob Jones University. The show includes survivor stories from BJU and also Bob Jones affiliated ministries like Christian day schools, camps, and churches. The podcast also explores BJU's influence beyond the school and its impact on American society. I want to thank my Patreon supporters who allow me to do this work, and if you could join my Patreon, it would be greatly appreciated. The link is in the description of every episode. But if you feel that you can't do that, then I would appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because this helps other listeners like you discover the show. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to have Lane White on the show today. How are you doing, Lane?
I am doing well. How are you, Andrew?
I am doing great. I'm so glad we could have this conversation. Thank you for being willing to pick another time to do this.
Yeah, I'm glad that you are working through this and understand enough that you have to take care of yourself before you can help anyone else. I just want to commend you for what you're doing. It's necessary and needful work that is long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for saying that. I've been definitely having to learn self-care as I'm still on my own healing journey and healing out loud. Honestly, I'm happy to do this podcast. It's been healing for me, even when it's triggering trauma at times. I know other people have reached out saying it's been healing, and I'm glad to be able to offer that space. For people who are not familiar with you, could you do a quick introduction and then share the years that you attended Bob Jones?
My name is Lane White. I have been with my partner for 32 years. We're raising our 15-year-old grandson. I have 4 dogs, all of them in the enormous category. I went to Bob Jones from fall of 84 through spring of 89 with intermittent semesters missed, trying to get enough money to stay in school.
Thank you for sharing that. I really love to start in the beginning with people's stories before Bob Jones. And I know from reading your story in the BJU and Me book, I saw that you grew up Baptist. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, what were those core experiences and things you felt growing up Baptist? What was that impact on you?
I was born in Colorado. When I reached school age, we were living in a suburb of Denver. My parents had me in a Christian school in Commerce City, and I attended there from preschool all the way up through the end of 7th grade. It was there that I had my first experience with BJU. I don't know that they would be classified as a feeder school per se, because this was back in the 70s, but they did get a visit. I remember particularly, I think I was in 2nd grade. They came, the typical teams that they send out, and they showed one of the Bob Jones promotionals and one of the BJU quartet singing. That was a pretty impactful experience, because that was before movies were really a big deal. Seeing a movie in school of all places was like, wow. I always had this image in my head that BJ was the place to be, basically. There's all these wholesome people, and everyone was always laughing and having a great time and learning. As a 2nd grader, you don't understand. That was my awareness of Bob Jones. We went to church essentially 3 times a week: Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesdays, if there was any other services, sunrise services, the New Year's Eve pray-ins, all of those, going to nursing homes on Sunday afternoon and singing to seniors and stuff like that. So it was a big part of our lives, right? That time was probably the first time I had any awareness that I was not happy with my physical shell. I hated wearing dresses. I just absolutely despised it. Worked for quite a while to come up with a plan to tell my parents that I didn't want to go to the Christian school anymore. I wanted to go to public school because I wanted to wear pants. As luck would have it, my parents moved all of us down to southeastern Colorado, and very small, tiny town, and I got to go to public school. So I never even had to have that conversation. Of course, my parents insisted that I wear a dress to the first day of class. And I was like, oh, come on. I thought I was getting out of this. Me and my passive aggressive tendencies. I wore this drabby ass skirt with tube socks and tennis shoes. It's okay. You're going to make me wear a dress. I'm going to be comfortable. But then I went to public high school all the way through senior high. I'm the oldest of 5. My sisters, the ones that are of school age at that point, went to a Christian school in another town about 12, 15 miles away that was associated with the church that we eventually ended up going to, that was a BJ feeder school and feeder church. The pastor and his wife were graduates. The youth pastor and his wife were BJ graduates. Yeah.
What church was this called?
Calvary Baptist in Lamar, Colorado.
Yeah, you can keep talking. I was
Yeah,
so
no.
curious about that.
Yeah, and I think by then my parents knew that it would be folly to try and get me to go to that school. Plus, they were even smaller than the school I went to, which there was 21 in my graduating class. Yeah, I think they recognized by then that the cat was out of the barn and there's no herding cats. Of course, BJ traveling teams would come to church, still very shiny, glossy, happy, shiny people kind of thing going on. Being alums, both the pastor and the youth pastor and their wives were all very BJ gung ho. So the indoctrination continues, even though I was wearing pants to school every day. I was always a pretty good student in school, and I had a real antagonistic streak. Rebellious is what some people would call it. My stepdad and I had a very cantankerous relationship. My parents had a rule that because I enjoyed going to public school, I became active as a student athlete. Basketball was my life. They basically had a if I ever got anything less than a B minus, then I could not play whatever sport I was involved with for that 6-week term until the next set of grades came out. And I had to have a B plus or A. I never really understood why they did that because I never had a problem getting good grades. I never had a problem being a student. However, typing really snagged me. And one term I had a B minus in typing, and it just wrecked me. I bawled all day because it was the middle of basketball season. You can't take 6 weeks out of a basketball season. I was staying after school every day to work on my typing. We had manual typewriters. I had incredible finger strength. We didn't get electric typewriters for a while, well before computers. So my parents and I came up with a plan for me to stay in basketball. I had to go to basketball camp at Bob Jones. I had to pay for the trip myself, and then I had to apply to 3 Christian colleges once. That was my sophomore year in high school. I had to apply to 3 Christian colleges by the end of my junior year. At that point, I would do anything. So I was like, okay, I'll do it. My second or third experience with Bob Jones was at a summer basketball camp, which was also a fabulous experience. A, I got to play basketball all day long. And B, it's during the summer. There weren't any regular students there. You got to stay in the dorms. It was like this crazy new experience. So again, you're left with this real positive impression that there was nothing negative to change your mind, right? The only thing that I could find at that point that was negative about the school is that you had to wear dresses. That was it. I went to that camp, never got a B minus again. In fact, I graduated with honors. Applied to Pillsbury, PCC, Pensacola, and Bob Jones. My guidance counselor told me I was an idiot, that I could have gotten into the Air Force Academy and she would have recommended me. She would have been one of the recommendations you have to get into a military academy. And because I certainly had the grades for it. But because she told me I was stupid for applying there, I said, watch this. That's actually how I ended up at Bob Jones. It was an act of rebellion, funny enough.
Wow, I would have never guessed that.
It was an
And
act
so,
of rebellion
wow,
because she told me I was stupid for doing that. And so I thought I killed multiple birds with one rock, right? My pastor will be happy. The youth pastor will be happy. My parents will be happy. And I'll get to piss off my high school guidance counselor. It was a win all the way around. The only drawback was is that I actually had to go.
what year did you start attending those?
I graduated in '84 and went that fall semester. So I
Okay.
went straight out of high school to Bob Jones. From this little tiny town, there were probably more people in my freshman class that lived in our entire town and probably the next 3 towns over. So I went from this really small, 100% white, rural high school, and actually school in general because it was K through 12, right? All in one roof. I never got homesick like some of the gals that were there in the dorms. I felt so bad, so I was glad to leave, right? I'm going to get my first taste of real independence. And so going to BJ, I knew what to expect, that I'd have to wear a dress every day, but beyond that, I really had no clue at all.
Leading up to Bob Jones, did you feel like you fit into the Baptist world or fundamentalist world?
At that point, that's where my acceptance lie. I was relatively well thought of in my church. I was really bullied in high school. I had spent a long time looking for a place where I fit. The closest I got back then was either on a sports team or at church. I didn't fit my family. I think I maybe had 2 really true friends in high school. I was always the one making the effort. I'd be going over to their place, seeking them out at church or what have you. I had this desire to just be wanted, to feel that I had some ability to be noticed. Not that I wasn't noticed, but I guess I wasn't noticed enough, or I didn't have that feeling of these are my people.
Did not have that sense of belonging.
It's weird to say that about your own family, right? But it was rancorous, the
Yeah.
relationship between me and my parents, just because I never really understood why my parents got divorced. I know now, and I don't blame my mom. She did the right thing by leaving. But when you're a kid and you have someone waltzes into your collective lives and starts to become this authoritarian figure because that's how he grew up. His parents were first generation Germans, always stiff upper lip. He was the middle kid, the only boy. He was expected to float on his own with no real support or backing of his parents. He joined the Navy right out of high school. That he had this vision of what a parent was supposed to be, and it was not something that sat well with me. We fought tooth and nail, like bitterly. I never really felt like I had something to call my own.
Yeah. And so you go to Bob Jones hoping to fit in or belong, getting away from your parents
Mm-hmm.
and thinking you would have freedom, but then realizing, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
not so much.
Tell me about when that realization happened. You get at Bob Jones, really excited to start having what you think is a dependence, but when did reality wake up to you and what did that reality look like?
Probably day 2. I figured it out pretty quickly. It's so deeply ingrained that you have to be molded into something better than yourself, right? And so it's almost like boot camp, right? Even with the physical demands, right? If you've ever gone from one end of that campus to the other in 4-inch heels at a dead sprint because you're going to be late to class, you get the physical part of it as well, on top of working 40 hours a week in the dining common. They tell you going in that this is going to be hard, but it'll be worth it, right? You've got such a great life in front of you. You're going to be able to do all these things because Bob Jones means something. And so you're like, okay, this is going to suck, but I have an end goal right?
It's for my good.
It's for my own good, and I need discipline, right? The in loco parentis, we're here to give you discipline in learning how to live as an adult, learning how to live as a Christian adult. The problem with that is they don't actually give you the tools to do that. They shove you in this deep little box, and if you try to pop your head out of that box, it's like the nail finds the hammer. I discovered it pretty quickly, but it was something that I accepted because I felt like it was something that I needed to do for my own personal maturation and, at that point, spiritual growth, right? So it was something that there was a lot of really hard things that happened that first year, just adjusting.
Yeah, yes. And something I want to dig into. So, what are some really core negative experiences you had at Bob Jones that really stood out to you?
So probably the first thing that really stood out to me was the snitch culture. I'm like the last person to say that if you see something, don't say something, because I feel like that there are things need to be called out, but for every single little inconsequential thing, you can get in serious trouble, right? And so that was probably the hardest thing for me to reckon with, and not being able to go off campus, right? Because back then, as a freshman, you could not go off campus without an upperclassman. I don't remember if we were allowed to go off campus as sophomores or not, but it was certainly not the first year, certainly not your freshman year. But the guys get to. It doesn't matter. You're a woman, you're a girl. Somebody might attack you. The restrictions on music and the fact that you couldn't have a car and no physical contact. That was the other thing that I found really weird. Not that I ever really sought out physical contact with a whole lot of people, but it wasn't because I didn't want to. It wasn't available to me. And now here I am in an area where I could potentially hold hands with somebody, and yet that was forbidden.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up because human touch is just a part of that innate desire and need for connection. They really demonized it. Any touch could become so sexual. That purity
Yeah.
culture will lead you down this dark path. I think it had such a negative impact on
Well, and
relationships.
it's about sex.
Yeah,
And yet nothing. There's so little in adult life, at least for me, that is about sex, right? That is such a small part of who we are. And yet it is your entire identity practically, right? Because if you weren't dating someone, you were looked at askance. And if you were dating someone, you were looked at askance. You couldn't win. You just couldn't win. You couldn't win for losing. And you couldn't have just a guy friend. That was not something that they recognized. There was always going to be this undercurrent of impropriety. They expected everyone to be improper, and that was the reason for
yeah,
the rules.
yeah. And then for you attending Bob Jones University at that time, you were presenting as a female. And what were the feelings presenting that way? Did feel like you fit into BJU's
Well,
expectations around being a
oh no,
female at that time?
I never fit their image of what it was to be a female. I didn't at that point have the language for who I am now. I didn't even have the language for same gender attraction. It never even really occurred to me. As I reflect back on my life, I see signposts. By itself, that didn't mean much. But if you take it as a whole collection of works, oh my gosh, here we are. No one else should have been surprised. I never fit their image, and that caused me a lot of problems there. So I changed my major halfway through my first sophomore semester. I was originally going to be in computer science, and then I decided to go into education. I'll give you three guesses as to which field of education I went into, and the first two don't count. When I changed my major to physical education, as time went on, I had physically demanding jobs in the dining common. My freshman year, they still had family style meals at night. And so I was a waitress at night, and I would have these little bodybuilding exercises that I would do, right? You have the silverware baskets, and you'd have 4 silverware baskets that were completely chock full. I would see if I could run down the aisle with both sets of silverware baskets, one in each hand, see if I could lift them up to the top shelf of the rack at the end of each row that we would have to put them on. And so that was like my weightlifting, other than carrying those trays on your shoulder and busting about the dining common doing that. And then 2 years later, that they opened up the tray return to women because they couldn't get enough guys to fill the crews. And they certainly couldn't have guys and girls working together. Oh, the horror. And so I ended up being crew chief for breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the tray check department, which was also very physically demanding. On top of that, I was a student referee for the women's intramurals. And my freshman year, I fixed the vacuum cleaners in the women's dorms, which again, signposts, right? Come on now. But all of those things led to me being noticed by the Dean of Women, which is something that you definitely did not want.
Who was the dean of women?
Barker was.
Louina
Barker or Baker. There was 2 of them. And I can't differentiate between the 2 now. Dean of Women and Assistant Dean of Women, one was Barker and one was Baker. Every time I got called in there, both of them were in there. 2 of the semesters, or 2 of the years I was there, I was in Sunday. And the current Dean of Women was actually my dorm supervisor back then. Yeah, full circle.
Whoa.
Isn't that
So
funny?
Deneen
Yeah.
Lawson was your dorm supervisor. How was that?
It's funny. She was hilarious. I'm serious. She was hilarious, but they used to have this skit with the floor monitors and her, and they would do the Alvin and the Chipmunk thing during the big dorm meetings, and it was a riot. But I guess she forgot how to be that person. The first time I got called in there, it was because I was wearing a jean jacket, and they didn't think that was appropriate attire for a young lady. The thing about it was the only coat I had. I was told that I had to go to counseling. I think by this time I was in Estelle. I had to go to counseling with the dorm supervisor for a full semester once a week, which was not counseling, by the way. They don't know what that word actually means. Otherwise, they were going to put me on spiritual probation, which would mean I couldn't do my refereeing jobs, one of the jobs I actually enjoyed. So again, I'm in this position where I'll do whatever you tell me to do because I don't want to be stopped from doing something that I actually love. So that was one. The other time that I got called up there, I was very broke. My work scholarship, which was an astounding $285 an hour. The thing of it was, I just learned that I've got ADHD. And so it explains why I lose my train of thought all the time. The second time I got called up there, I was very poor, and this was back when they had a cosmetology school. I don't know if they still have that. It was in the basement of Gaston, the same place where all of our PO boxes were if you didn't have a PO at the main place in the middle of campus. I learned my freshman year that my hair being as straight as a board and incredibly thin, I was going to need to buy stock in Aquanet if I wanted to curl my hair. I would walk outside and go from coiffed to looking like a drowned rat. I started doing perms. I could only afford 1 perm a semester at the cosmetology school, if that tells you anything. I would go in there and I would tell them, and for those that, especially our male audience, if you don't know anything about perms, there are different sizes of perm rods. The smallest rod was a red rod. I would have my entire head done in red rod. I would come out of that thing looking, I had a white afro, right? Because it was humid and so it would go frizz. So then I discovered mousse. And I used mousse, and so I just kept these really tight curls because I worked so much. I never had time to really comb it out. So I ran around campus all day with this moussed up, wet look hair. and they hated that. Oh my God, they hated that. I got called in to be berated about how I wore my hair and was told that they were going to make me start wearing a wig. And I said, absolutely not. That was the only time I had enough nerve to stare someone in the administration down. And I was just like, no, I'm not doing that. You just go sit and spin because I'm not doing that. On top of that, by then my rebellious streak had started coming back out. I got the brightest neon red lipstick that you could buy. And the compromise was that, okay, you have to start combing the gel out of your hair, the mousse out of your hair. So I would wear this bright red lipstick. Couldn't afford any other makeup. And I'm pale. The music video Addicted to Love, where they've got those chicks in the background with the bright red lipstick strumming on the guitars. It's like that. But then I added another flair to it. Oh, these wide neon laces were in style back then. And so I would get an extra long neon yellow shoelace and I would double it up and tie it around my head like a headband. So I would walk home from the dining common from working with this bright red lipstick, gelled up or moussed up, super tight perm, and this neon headband. And there was nothing in the dress code that says you couldn't wear a headband. There may be now, there wasn't then. And I found little ways to thumb my nose, but they did not appreciate that at all. They did not appreciate that. And by then, I had figured out that I was never going to be their image of this Southern genteel Christian woman, and that I had never been a
Yeah,
Southern genteel woman.
and I'm curious with your journey with your gender identity and sexuality, what was your knowledge of that during your time at BJU? I guess more towards the end.
So, because of finances, about every third or fourth semester, I would have to sit out a semester. And by then, I was no longer living with my parents. I had moved to Kansas City and was living with my birth father. In order to keep pace, I took a class at the local community college for one of the classes I knew I was going to need, which was anatomy and physiology. My lab partner and I ended up hitting it off, and we just got along well, right? And it was one of those things where I almost found instant acceptance with her. It was something I had never experienced before. Instant acceptance? Are you kidding? And so through her, I ended up meeting my first girlfriend, which at the time I did not know that she was my first girlfriend. However, in hanging out with that particular group of gals, I started to have my suspicions, right? We ended up together. That was one of the times where I ended up staying out a semester. We dated pretty steadily, but I didn't know how to align that with who I thought I was supposed to be. She and I would have many discussions on things that were very normal for a lesbian relationship, but absolutely not normal for the way I grew up. Prior to that, I honestly think that had I ever really met someone in the LGBT community, I would have not have known. I really do think that if I did know someone, they didn't know it either, just because of the environments that I grew up in. And because I had such a hard time with that, by the time I finally came to accept that this was just who I was, consequences be damned, she was ready to move on. And at that point, I had already decided that I wasn't going back to Bob Jones. Without her, I didn't have any reason not to go back because I needed to get away. It crushed me. It was one of the hardest things because it meant something by then. And it was this connection with another person on a whole nother level that I never in my wildest dreams thought was possible because everything else was performative role filling. There was never this intense personal connection that I had with my first girlfriend. I went over to my best friend's work. He was a night stalker at a grocery store, and I hung out with him. I was like, it's 90%. I'm not going back. He ended up giving me a car. It was an old 76 Plymouth Fury. It was a boat. It was enormous. And my dad ended up making change out of the offering plate that Sunday morning to give me enough gas money and book money. Within 2 days of her breaking up with me, I was driving back to Bob Jones with a broken heart, and I couldn't tell anyone. That was probably the hardest thing that I ever went through, to feel so alone. I couldn't tell my family. I couldn't talk it over with her. She wasn't talking to me by then. And there was no one at school that I could confide in. I was totally and utterly alone. She called me on a couple of different occasions. And of course, the dorm phones back then were rotary dial on the wall with a 100-foot long cord. And if you wanted to have a private conversation, you sat in the bottom of the closet and you talked in the closet. Here I am talking in the closet because I am in the closet. And I would just be bawling my eyes out, right? Because I was still desperately in love with her, or at least the idea of being wanted by someone. That was probably more of it, but I didn't know how to split those two things apart. So I fought that so much that I ended up getting back together with an ex-fiance of mine who was in the Navy. I thought, I'm going to do this because I can tolerate this guy and I'm never going to feel like that again, ever. I'm not going there again. I can't, right? And that's what led to my demise at Bob Jones, because he came out the week before commencement 1989. 2 days later, we ran off to Justice of Peace and got married because we were going to be driving back to San Diego. Turns out that was a little prescient on our part because we ended up getting a wreck in Yuma, Arizona. And if I hadn't been married to him at that point, the Navy wouldn't have taken care of my bills. But because I was now a service dependent, when we were in the hospital, I didn't have to worry about bills for that. I ended up getting that annulled like a year later because it was just like, this is such a lie. I thought I could live my life in a relationship where I could tolerate the other person, but not necessarily be as madly, hopelessly in love as I had been with my first girlfriend. By then, I was on my own in Kansas City, living in and out of my car, and starting to explore the quote unquote lesbian side of life.
Yeah. And so I just want to come back to Bob Jones. You were expelled from Bob Jones before you graduated because you got
Yeah.
married.
I couldn't come back, right? That summer, I was in San Diego and I kept on waiting for my readmission packet and it never came. I called the school and they put me over to Tony Miller and he said, you got married without permission before commencement. You have to have your school bill paid off and you have to have a pastoral recommendation and you got to wait 2 years. And that was that. It was over then. There was nothing because I knew that was never going to happen. I was left with nothing. I invested tens of thousands of dollars in not just tuition and books, but accoutrement, right? Because you got to buy shoes and dresses and all this other crap. And I was going to try and transfer. My friend, the one that introduced me to my first girlfriend, we were still friends. She was going to KU at the time. I looked at going to KU. And I thought, well, I'll just be able to pick up where I left off. No. KU was like, no, you don't have any accredited credits because at that point, Bob Jones was not accredited. At that point in time, Bob Jones did not accept any Pell Grants. They did not accept any federal loans, nothing. The only thing I got outside of work scholarship was each semester I could get a $1,000 18% interest loan from the business department to pay some of my school bill off before I could come back. Yeah, it was really disillusioning for me. This was never about my spiritual growth. This was never about my edification. This was about, can I live up to what you expect of this Stepford wife kind of image? and how much money I have. I didn't have parents that could afford to send me to school. We were poor growing up. That left me really pretty disillusioned for a long time. And so I went into this period of spiritual exile. I had my core beliefs, right? Christianity as a cornerstone for how to live your life honorably, but I quit going to church because nobody could explain to me how I could be LGBT and a Christian at the same time.
I'm curious about your journey to discovering your identity, your true self.
Yeah, once I was on my own and I started making friends in Kansas City, I met my current partner in 92, and it was probably 5 years after that, maybe, where I started to meet people that were trans. I started seeing things on TV. The very first time I heard any trans man or trans mask story was on HBO, a movie called Southern Comfort. It was about a trans man who ended up dying of ovarian cancer because he couldn't get treated. It was like somebody shot me in the middle of my forehead. I was like, is that me? Is that me? And it was, and it is. So I wrestled with that for a while because here I am in a lesbian relationship, and lesbians are pretty well known for not dating men. And so I kept it to myself for a while. I ended up telling Carmen at one point, and it didn't matter to her. And so I told a few of my friends, and it didn't matter to them either. But that's as far as it went because I couldn't afford any kind of treatment. I didn't have any health insurance at the time. I didn't know about some of the social structures that are available now that may have been available then, but I didn't know how to access them. And every time, because back then you had to have 12 months of essentially psychotherapy before you could even start to transition. I tried on a couple of different occasions when I finally got health insurance through a job to start that process. When you walk in and they've got Bible verses on the wall and they start telling you that you need to fix your life in the Bible, you don't go back. You just don't. I thought for a long time that I'm just going to have to live with this and just be butch. And so that's, for those of you who may not be aware, butch is just basically a really masculine or the typical stereotype that you would think of, flannel shirts and has a card carrying member to Lowe's. It wasn't until 2007 I finally told my parents. They had come out for a family event at my house. They still lived in Colorado. In fact, everybody still lived in Colorado. I was the only defector at that point. I remember we were going to Sam's and my mom said something about her breasts. And I was like, if I had my way, I'd just chop them off. I hate them. And they looked at me and I was like, yeah, I've never liked anything about being female. Never. Never really wanted kids. Never expected to get pregnant. There was nothing female about me other than societal expectations. That was when I came out to my folks as trans. And since all of my sisters were at my house, I came out to them at the same time, and they were like, we always thought you were more of a boy than a lesbian anyway, right? That was almost anticlimactic. But at the same point in time, I didn't have any tools to actually start moving in that direction. And that really hasn't happened for me until basically the last year or so.
Thank you so much for sharing that. When you stop someone from being themselves, it's like a pressure cooker that builds up, and so much pain and mental health problems come out of suppressing your authentic self. That's what Bob Jones University does. That's what fundamentalism does. They want to create you into their image, put you in
Yeah.
this box, and that's not how we're meant to be or function as humans, healthily at least. Something I'm curious about is you being trans and also a Christian now. And I'm really curious your journey through that. I think people can be LGBTQ and Christian, but there's a lot
Mhm.
of stigma around it, unfortunately, in conservative Christianity. It's no, you have to choose one or the other.
For a long time, I would still make attempts to go to church. My first girlfriend had introduced me to MCC, which, for those of you who are not aware, MC Metropolitan Community Church was founded by Reverend Troy Perry, and it was specifically geared towards LGBT people who still needed and wanted a spiritual relationship with, whether you call them God or your higher power or whatever. But I had attended, and because I was still so legalistic and ritualistic in my experience with Christianity, I couldn't get comfortable, right? Because I still had not been able to accept the message that God actually does love you for who you are, just because of the misinterpretation of the clobber passages. One experience in particular, Carmen and I were visiting my parents, and they always, "Why don't you come to church with us?" Went to this church called the Cowboy Church. It was very small, and we were sitting 3 or 4 rows from the front where my parents sat. The pastor literally changed his sermon mid-sermon and started preaching about how you can't be gay and a Christian. And just because I was brought up to not raise a stink in church, we sat there through the whole service. I also threw a lot of rocks from the back wheels of my truck immediately after it was over. I was furious. I was livid. And I decided at that point in time, I was never going to volunteer for another beating. I chose to live with my spirituality, with my own personal ethics, but I was not going to attend a church that treated me like that. This was probably 5 or 6 years later. This was back like kind of the beginning of the internet. I was listening, I was still seeking, I was still searching. And I found a message online by Mel White, who was the ghostwriter for Jerry Falwell. And I listened to one of his sermons about the centurion and his pais. It was like a dam broke. I was bawling my eyes out because it was like, finally someone has shown me from the Bible that God accepts me for who I am, right? That this is not a conditional kind of love, right? It transcends human conditions. So we started going to MCC, downtown Kansas City, and I found a fabulous home with the people there. The problem was I still had this legalistic, ritualistic, you have to do these certain things for it to be legitimate, for it to be legitimate worship, for it to be a legitimate Christianity, right? And I helped one of the other parishioners there who had previously been a very homophobic, on the radio pastor who came out as gay. Spirit of Hope had taken him in, and he would preach every now and then, and it was like the kind of preaching I was used to, right? So it really got me going, right? It gave me that Bible thumping spirit back. We started our own kind of, I shudder to think about this now, fundamentalist gay church, basically. And it just sucked me dry because the expectations to participate and to hold up the structure of a brand new church on the backs and the shoulders of a handful of people was just really taxing. We ended up leaving Kansas City, and we moved down to Arkansas, and I didn't go to church for quite a while, although I was starting to miss it. So I went on Believe Out Loud to look for local affirming churches in Northwest Arkansas. There was no MC. The only church that was anywhere close to where I lived was St. Paul's Episcopal in Fayetteville. I thought, I've never been an Episcopalian. I don't even know what it's about. All I knew is that they were one of the not Christian Christians. That's the way I was raised. I went, and it was completely different. They're very liturgical, but it was like, I think of Psalms 23, where he leads you beside still waters. He restores your soul. I got that from the very first time I visited. And I ended up attending a local Episcopal church. We ended up moving to another town. Actually, we moved to Siloam Springs, which there's another Christian college there, John Brown University. So I had BJU and JBU, although John Brown was not nearly as strict as Bob Jones. Anyway, I attended Grace Episcopal in Siloam Springs, and it was one of the most healing spiritual experiences in my life. They were not just accepting, they were affirming. I had a meeting with the rector before we started attending, and I was like, this is who we are, right? And because again, I'm not signing up for any beatings. He was like, you're welcome here, right? So that was really affirming for me. I still consider myself an Episcopalian, although the closest Episcopal church to me is now a solid half an hour, 45 minutes away. I'm not a morning person, and their services being at 9:30 in the morning on a Sunday just doesn't work for me. They don't have an evening collect. I have yet to attend that church. One of these days, if my insomnia wraps around to a Sunday morning, I might drive to Woodward because not all Episcopal churches are for me. But that's where I currently am in my spiritual journey, although I am starting to question a lot of things about what we were taught to believe and how we were raised. I think that God and God's design for humanity reaches way beyond the boundaries that Christianity limits God to, right? I'm starting to explore a little bit with the Apocrypha and what we know of the early era civilizations, right? And how much crossover there is between the stories of the Old Testament and the stories of other civilizations. And many of them are parallel, they're like mirrors of each other. It started to make me think that there's probably more going on here than anyone I've known personally has given credit to. It's like having a 10,000 piece puzzle and you've got 8 pieces in one corner. Well, we don't have the whole picture, right? Maybe that's what Paul means by seeing through a glass darkly. But I think we as humans, and especially those of us who have identified as Christians for so long, create a box that is so much smaller than who God is. It makes sense because I was pushed into a box my whole life. In a sacrilegious sort of way, I understand how God feels. God is not one to be placed in a human shaped box. We were made in the image of, supposedly, but it's a lot of hubris,
Yeah.
right? It's a lot of human hubris to say, this is all I believe the story of God
Yeah.
entails. But I think the picture is so much bigger, and I think it's been manipulated by man through the years and through the centuries, because even the word homosexuality never even appears in the Bible until what, 46 or something like that. It's man's bias and translation bias and probably other nefarious things as well, not just pure error, that have shaped our view of who God is and how it relates to creation and ourselves.
Thank you for sharing that. What is your advice for someone who is LGBTQ but also wants to keep their faith and is struggling with that? What is your advice for them?
I think I would say there's a lot of excellent literature and podcasts. There's a plethora of resources that are out there now that had not been available in the past. Find the literature that speaks to you. Read, listen, and don't let your preconceived ideas dictate. Be a student of who you are, and be willing to admit to yourself who you are, because it's not bad. You don't have to listen to the trash in your head when the truth in your heart is telling you something different. That's the biggest thing I could say. And then find someone, whether it's an affirming church, a partner, or whoever it happens to be. If you're lucky enough, find someone that you can confide in, right? Find someone that will accept you for who you are. Surround yourself with those people, because they want to see you succeed.
Yeah, that is wonderful advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. And is there anything else you would like to say before we end this episode?
Don't go to Bob Jones.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Live your life. That would be my advice. Live your life. Be content with who God made you to be. Don't try to make yourself into someone that God did not intend you to be.
Oh, yeah, it's very powerful. Thank you again for coming on the podcast today. And thank you for people listening. This was Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism. I wanted to take this opportunity to point people towards an LGBTQ plus resource called Jacob's Ladder, and it is geared toward people in South Carolina and the upstate area. But I highly recommend checking out the resources in that, and it is linked in the description. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. My Patreon supporters allow me to do this work, and I am so grateful for them. If you could join my Patreon community, it would be greatly appreciated. But if you feel you cannot do that, if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, because this helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.